Well, here we are, day 2 of my big adventure of speaking in front of a camera, which is really weird. It probably looks to you like I'm not looking directly at the camera. That's because I'm not. I'm looking at my picture. If I didn't have my picture there, I wouldn't be able to speak at all. I mean, it's hard for me to speak now, but at least I'm looking at a face, at least I can talk kind of at myself. If I were just looking at it, directly at the camera, it'd be a lot harder. That's so weird to try to make eye contact with the camera. I'm impressed with any YouTuber that's able to do this. But anyway, that's why I'm doing this, to try to learn, to try to be able to speak clearly and stuff, as I explained in my first video. So today, I wanted to talk about apologetic methods and noetic structures. If I get to noetic structures, I may stop with apologetic methods. I'm going to try to keep these videos relatively short until, I improve my skills in speaking, in which case I may start going a little bit longer. Let's see. So, apologetic methods. There are 3 apologetic methods that I'm aware of, broadly speaking, for how to defend Christianity. There's classical apologetics, evidential apologetics, and presuppositional apologetics. I was a little bit fuzzy on the distinction between classical and evidential apologetics, so I did a quick Google a few minutes ago to make sure that I do something about it. So, according to what I read, classical apologetics is where you start with basic things like the existence of God, and you argue in steps all the way up to the God of Christian theism and the resurrection of Jesus and who Jesus is and all of that kind of stuff. So it's kind of a gradualist, stepwise approach to defending Christianity. Evidential apologetics is when you go straight to the historical Jesus and you say, well, if Jesus is the Messiah, if you can prove that Jesus is the Messiah, well, then you get everything else in Christianity thrown in. Because if he's the Messiah, then that means that his God is the true God, etc. And so it's a more direct approach. I don't really understand why there has to be a distinction between those two things, because it seems to me that the classical approach is evidential in the sense that even though you're using a stepwise approach, you're still using evidences and arguments to argue your points and stuff. Most of the theistic arguments, with the exception of the ontological argument, do point to something out in the world as evidence. For example, some of the cosmological arguments will point to motion, which can be observed, or they'll point to, Big Bang cosmology or something to try to show that the universe had a beginning or something like that. So they're pointing to things that are accessible to everybody. There's one cosmological argument that doesn't really do that. The argument from contingency is a little bit more philosophical, I guess. But the modal argument is almost just pure reason. But anyway, the third one is called presuppositional apologetics. And this one doesn't argue to Christianity at all. It argues from Christianity. It presupposes that Christianity exists and then tries to make sense of the world in light of that. And the underlying commitment of the presuppositionalist is that Christianity is the only coherent worldview. And any other worldview that you try to adopt that does not match Christianity is inevitably going to have some incoherency in it. And so usually the way presuppositionalists proceed is if they're encountering somebody who believes differently than they are, they'll accuse that person of borrowing from the Christian worldview. So for example, the big one that they bring up is logic. They believe that the only way logic can exist is if God exists. God is the ground and foundation and explanation and reason for the existence of logic. So if you don't believe in God, then you don't have any basis for believing in logic. And so if somebody comes along and tries to make an argument against the existence of God, well, that's necessarily going to be a self-refuting argument, because you would be using logic to prove the non-existence of the only thing that could possibly ground logic. My own perspective is any argument that's a sound argument is a good argument. I mean, I don't, I don't subscribe to that particular argument the presuppositionalists used. It's not clear to me that you need God to have logic. It seems to me like you need logic to have God, because I mean, what would the existence or non-existence of God mean if you didn't have the law of non-contradiction? Because if you didn't have the law of non-contradiction, the statement God does not exist would be an incoherent statement. So would the statement that God does exist. So the only way to say that one is true and the other is false is if you have the law of non-contradiction or the law of excluded or something. So anyway, as far as the way that presuppositionalists engage people, at least the way I've seen them engage people, is a little bit on the obnoxious side, because what they'll do is they'll badger the other person with questions, but they won't defend any of their own views. And so, for example, you know, the whole transcendental argument is based on this idea that you need God to have logic, but they rarely ever give any argument or justification for believing that premise. Instead, what they do is they just object every time an atheist says anything and say, oh, you're borrowing from my worldview, because by your use of logic, you're presupposing the existence of God. So you're borrowing from Christianity. And so, but they never demonstrate that. They just assert it. And then it drives, I've seen atheists react to this, and it just drives them nuts, which I guess may be part of the reason presuppositionalists do it. If I were a presuppositionalist, I would not use that method. I would actually try to substantiate it. There was this famous argument between Greg Bahnsen and Gordon Stein on the existence of God. And Greg Bahnsen used the presuppositionalist approach. And he did attempt to give a justification for why the laws of logic require God. His argument was that the laws of logic are laws of thought. They govern how we're supposed to think or whatever. And so since the laws of logic are laws of thought, they require an ultimate mind. And since the laws of logic are necessary laws, that means the mind that contains them is a necessary mind. And that was kind of his argument for God. I guess I don't want to go into whole detail about presuppositionalism. I just wanted to make clear that there are these three methods of these three approaches to Christianity. And I personally just think that any sound argument should be used. So I don't have anything against any of the arguments. Well, I do have a problem with some of the particular arguments that each of them use, but I don't have a problem with the fact that they're using arguments or the kinds of arguments that they use. Like the moral argument, for example, is kind of a presuppositional argument, or it can be depending on how it's defended. And I'm on board with that. So, although I'm willing to use presuppositional arguments, I'm not what you would call a presuppositional onlyist. In other words, I don't think that you should only use presuppositional arguments. I think you should just use any argument that's sound, it seems to me. I mean, we should use all the tools that we have at our disposal to defend Christianity or whatever point of view we're trying to defend. As far as in practice, I guess I'm more of a classical apologist, and the reason I'm a classical apologist is because of how I think noetic structures work. A noetic structure, I was going to show you a book, but I don't want to get up and go get the book because then I have to edit the video. I don't want to edit the video. There's a book called Faith and Reason, and it's by Ronald Nash. And that's where I first heard this whole concept of a noetic structure. A noetic structure is the sum total of all of your beliefs and everything you know. And so we all have this tendency to want to have our beliefs be consistent with each other, but we don't always succeed. Sometimes we hold inconsistent beliefs. And a lot of times the reason for that is simply because we don't think about two things at the same time. For example, when I was in high school, if I was having a Bible study with one of my friends, and they said, "Do you think it's wrong to lie to people?" I would say, "Yeah, of course that's wrong." And if they asked me if I thought that somebody who was lying was responsible for it or was culpable for it, I would say, "Well, of course they are." But if you were asking me while I was in my physics class, "Do you think that everything is determined by whatever came before?" I would have said yes. Because when I took physics in high school, I remember doing these free body diagrams. You had to draw a little box, and then you had to draw little vectors coming off the box. Like you had a force going in this direction, you had gravity going in that direction, and all these different things going on. And what you're supposed to do is sum over all these vectors to find out what the net force on that object was, and then use the equation force equals mass times acceleration, and you could predict exactly where that object was going to move next. And it occurred to me while we were doing these free body diagrams that everything in the universe is part of this whole causal system and stuff. And that meant that if you knew the exact position of every particle in the entire universe, and you knew all the forces, like gravity, electromagnetic force, all that kind of stuff, or collisions or whatever, there are laws of collision. If you knew all the laws of nature and you knew all the initial conditions, you should be able to predict everything that's going to happen. And so I was basically a hard determinist. But I at the time, I never thought about hard determinism and morality at the same time, and it never occurred to me that I was holding inconsistent beliefs, but I was. So anyway, every now and then you'll be in a situation where somebody will give you an argument for A, and it seems persuasive. Somebody will give you an argument for not A, and that also seems persuasive. And they can't both be true. And so you'll wrestle with it. They both seem, when taken in isolation, they both seem true, but they obviously can't both be true. And so you'll have this cognitive dissonance, and you'll wrestle with it and try to work it out. And eventually you'll either work it out or you'll just get tired of thinking about it. Everybody has a different noetic structure. So whenever you're faced with new information, and that new information is inconsistent with what you already believe, you're naturally going to treat it with some skepticism, because we all have this natural tendency. We all have kind of the law of non-contradiction built into us. So whenever we see a contradiction, we automatically think there's a mistake here somewhere. And so if there's a contradiction between what you believe and a piece of information that you just became privy to, you're going to have this natural tendency to want to reconcile them. You're either going to reject the piece of information, or you're going to change your belief to accommodate the new information, or you're going to find some synthesis or something. You're going to work it out somehow. And so it's because of noetic structures that two people can look at the same evidence or the same piece of information and come to different conclusions. It's because each of them has a different noetic structure. Each of them interacts. And it's impossible to interact with the world around you without interacting with it through the screen of your noetic structure. So you're constantly interpreting everything you encounter in light of what you already know and believe. And that's why it's easier for some people to believe something than it is for another. For example, if you believe in God already, it's probably going to be easier for you to be convinced that a miracle has occurred than it would be if you did not believe in God. Because if you did not believe in God, then there's probably no way you could believe that a miracle took place. But if you do believe in God, then you can at least allow for the possibility that a miracle took place. And so it's because of noetic structures, or the way noetic structures work, that I tend to favor the classical approach, practically speaking. Because in the classical approach, you inch your way to the conclusion that Christianity is true in small steps. In this way, it offends somebody's noetic structure not as much. I mean, if I tried to convince you that Jesus was raised from the dead and you didn't believe that anything supernatural existed, that would be quite the undertaking. But if I could first persuade you that there were souls, and that souls could survive the death of their body, and that there was a God, and all this kind of stuff was going on, a whole supernatural realm, then I wouldn't have to overcome quite as many obstacles to your belief in the resurrection. So in the classical approach, you start small. You start with, what is pretty well accepted, like the laws of logic, for example, or consciousness. Consciousness is something that we're immediately aware of, and one can make arguments from consciousness to the existence of a soul. And then from there, you've opened up the whole door to the supernatural, because now the physical world is not all that exists. And from there, now that you're open to the idea that the physical world is not all that exists, then it becomes easier to persuade you that there's a God. And then once I've persuaded you that there's a God, then it becomes easier to persuade you that Jesus rose from the dead, or something like that. So it's a stepwise thing. There are apologists, or what are they called? Presuppositionalists, a lot of them, especially James White. I listen to his podcast all the time because I'm a Calvinist, and there's a lot of Calvinists that are presuppositionalists. So I listen to them a lot. And James White is one of the ones I listen to. He has a serious problem with that, and it's not just that he thinks the arguments for classical theism are unsound. There are presuppositionalists who argue that way, but he has a moral problem with it. He thinks it's inappropriate to put an atheist in a position of judging God. Now, to me, that strikes me as being sophistry, to object to an argument because it puts God on the witness stand or something like that. Because what we're really doing, and what all of us have to do, whether you're a presuppositionalist or not, is use your own cognitive abilities to the best of your ability, your own cognitive functions to the best of your ability, to distinguish between what's true and what's false. Anytime you affirm anything at all, even your own existence, you're using your cognitive ability, you're using your cognitive faculties to the best of your ability to arrive at the truth. You have nothing but your own mind with which to do your believing. So I don't see how it could possibly be inappropriate for somebody to ask the question, does God exist? And to try to answer that question by using their cognitive faculties. And when you're using your cognitive faculties, you're reasoning. When presuppositionalists don't escape this. Presuppositionalists are using their own cognitive faculties to make the transcendental argument. Because they have to argue somehow that God is necessary for logic, and they have to use their cognitive faculties to believe in logic. If you think about it, a lot of presuppositional arguments really aren't that different than classical and evidential arguments, because they're using things like logic as evidence for the existence of God. You can put it in a syllogism. You can put the transcendental argument in a syllogism. If there's no God, then there's no logic. But there is logic, therefore there is a God. That's basically the same as a lot of evidential arguments for God. So I don't see why there needs to be that distinction. So yeah. So I might want to make another point about noetic structures, which is that, whoa, have I been going 18 minutes? Okay, so one more point about noetic structures is there are some, well, I have two more points. One of them is a lot of people, John Loftus being one of them, believe that if you want to examine whether or not Christianity is true, you have to kind of treat it like you're an outsider, like come to it from an outside point of view or something like that. And what this seems to me to mean, and maybe I've got a misunderstanding about it, it seems to mean that you should just get rid of everything or just ignore what you already believe and know and approach it from there. I think that's a mistake, because what if everything you believe, you have some justification for believing it, or for some, what it seems to you at least, to be a good reason for believing it? Well, if that's the case, then it seems to me that it ought to factor in to what you're trying to figure out. And so this outsider approach, it seems on its surface to just be saying we should be objective in our search for truth. And I agree, we should be objective, we should be fair-minded and all this kind of stuff. But if it means you have to forget all you know or think you know, that seems to me to be a mistake. Because everything you know and believe, now you should be open to changing your mind about things if it's necessary, but you shouldn't pretend that you don't believe what you already believe just in order to find out to accommodate some new piece of information. You should weigh them. You should weigh this new evidence or information against what you already believe, and maybe it will justify jettisoning what you already believe, but you shouldn't just ignore it to begin with before you even look at the evidence. So that's one point I wanted to make. And that's, if you think about it, that's the way Bayes' theorem works too. In Bayes' theorem, basically what you do is you try to update the probability of something. So you've got some initial probability of something that's based on all of your background beliefs, in other words, what you already know. And you update that probability in light of new information that you've come across. Now notice in Bayes' theorem that your background beliefs matter a lot. And so you wouldn't want to just ignore your background beliefs in order to assess this new information. Your background beliefs are very important. And so I don't advocate anybody just ignoring them. So the second point I wanted to make about it is the fact that since, in light of the fact that everybody has a noetic structure, and in light of the fact that a noetic structure can make it easy for a person to change their mind or difficult for a person to change their mind, we all ought to cut each other slack. There's this tendency when two people are in an argument on the internet and one of them gets the better of the other, that they'll berate the person for not changing their mind right away. But if you think about it, it would be irresponsible for them to change their mind right away. Or they'll berate them for being stubborn, for not just, seeing the light. You stump somebody, and yet they still persistently hold on to the view. So you accuse them of being stubborn. Well, they may not be stubborn. The difficulty they're having in changing their view is the fact that although they don't know the answer to your argument, or they don't know how to respond to your argument, it could be that the conclusion that argument brings them to contradicts something that they already believe, and they've got to mull it over and figure out, well, how do I reconcile these two things? Should I give up this belief that I have, or is there a flaw in this argument that I'm not seeing? And so I don't think anybody, if you get stumped in a debate or an argument, nobody should change their mind immediately. You should mull it over. Spend some time thinking about it. See what other people have to say about it. Because maybe there's a flaw in the argument that you didn't see before, or maybe there's a flaw in what you already believe and you need to change that. And that is all I have to say about apologetic methods and noetic structures. There you have it.